welcome to my show.
Thank you.
Why is the racial violence against Aboriginal people unresolved for so long?
I think because we had such a racist colonial past, and the way that Australia was colonised was quite unlawful and brutal. Typically around the world, there were treaties made with Indigenous peoples. That didn't happen here, and Aboriginal people were really treated as not humans, as people to be violently dispossessed, people to be exploited for labour in a way that was similar to slavery. So we have this very long, violent, racist and brutal history that hasn't been tackled yet in Australia. And racism has bubbled away. Racist violence and even killing of Aboriginal children and youth has happened. Perpetrators haven't been held to account. We're not actually implementing our fundamental human rights commitments to end racism, although we've signed the treaty. It's not happening in practice, and non-Indigenous people are still acting in a very oppressive way, including through institutions, including through the legal bodies that are established to address racism.
As an Aboriginal, have you personally experienced any unfair treatment?
Yes, I have. It begins when you're a child in school and you are called names. And nowadays, these racist names may not be as common, but it's exclusion and bullying that Aboriginal children experience. And as you get older, it's more like attitudinal issues. For very dark-skinned people, it can be another experience of actually being watched in shops and followed around as if they're thieves. That's a very common one. I have once actually is abuse by police, and I experienced that when I was taking part in a demonstration to protect an Aboriginal significant site linked to the Woggle, who's the creator spirit for our country here. But police can be very rough in their interactions with Aboriginal people, and we've had people actually die in custody, sadly.
There has been a systematic cleansing of Aboriginal culture throughout the history of both the US and Canada. Does similar cleansing exist in Australia?
We certainly have had a history officially recognised as genocidal, and that's a very serious finding against a country, but it was justified on the basis of the evidence, particularly in relation to the systematic removal of Aboriginal children from their families and their communities, and the purpose of those policies and laws, which took place for over 100 years, was really to end the Aboriginal people as a race of people. So it certainly was a form of genocide. And although the assimilation policy has been rejected since the 1970s, many Aboriginal people experience systemic and structural discrimination, racism, and also some kind of expectation very often that they be just like white Australians still, which is very wrong in this day and age.
You were involved in opposing the destruction of the govt shrine in 2020. What are the dilemmas facing the protection of Aboriginal lands and cultures of Australia?
The main issue is that Aboriginal people's human rights to protect culture, which is very closely linked to land and sacred sites. The spirituality and culture is embedded in our land, our mother Earth, and in the dream time. And the laws and legislations in Australia do not give Aboriginal people the right to actually say no when a site is so important and significant that it really mustn't be destroyed for mining or development. And in West Australia, it's believed that well over 1,000 Aboriginal sacred sites or heritage sites have been destroyed against the wishes of Aboriginal custodians from those lands. And people Indigenous people say, we won't be able to keep our culture alive when we don't have any of our lands, our sacred, important lands, left to, have the relationship with this country as Indigenous people.
While the Australian government often accuses other countries of human rights violations, do you think such accusations are convincing?
And what we see is Australia taking part, of course, in the United Nations processes. At one stage, we're considered to be a leader. When we signed the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, at the same time, Indigenous people were considered legally second-class citizens, and children were able to be removed at whim for assimilation purposes. So certainly Australia needs to increase respect for human rights and not just verbally, but ensuring that there's investment into the realisation of those rights, particularly Indigenous people. There certainly is, unfortunately, a level of hypocrisy in failing to do that properly to date.
Has the Australian government provided enough assistance? How can the Australian government tackle the problem the Indigenous people face?
Yes, I have, along with many Indigenous people across the country, a expectation that we must see better from our governments, and particularly our federal government, we feel has more integrity to Indigenous people generally. In West Australia, where I live, we don't see the commitment from my government at all, and Aboriginal people feel that it's a very outdated, paternalistic, dismissive attitude to Indigenous people, which is very much inconsistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that Australia has endorsed for over 10 years now. So we will continue to be strong advocates for human rights and to call on Australia to implement the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, including through a national action plan, to uphold our human rights obligations and the advice of the UN treaty bodies, and to increase our commitment where we need to in law, including through, for example, the optional protocol process to the Convention on Children.